Modern Warfare 4's beta is here, but can a budget i3 and Intel Arc setup actually keep up with the powerhouse i7 and 4080 build? Let's find out if the latest Call of Duty is well optimized for everyone, or if you really need top tier hardware to compete. For testing, let's use both my personal machine and my secondary testing build, both of which are LG A1700 based, with a 14700K and i3-12100 in each respectively. My personal machine has a Z690 motherboard with 64GB of faster 3600 megatransfer per second DDR4, and a 360mm Corsair H150i on cooling duties. With an RTX 4080, this system is equipped to handle literally anything you throw at it. And although the card is now a generation old, it's still plenty fast enough to be able to handle MW4 at any settings and resolution. And then in the other corner, the i3 build has a B760 MSI motherboard with 32GB of 2666 megatransfer DDR4, and an ARC A770 16GB on graphics duties. This will provide a nice contrast to the other ultra expensive system, and should expose us to both GPU and CPU bottlenecks in different situations. The full system spec list is in the description should you wish to replicate anything you see in this video. With the rough system specs out of the way, let's dive into the performance of the beta, and see what you can expect on expensive and more budget-conscious hardware. To see how the game performs on a more budget-optimized build, I first tested on the Intel GPU system, to provide a look into how the new version of the engine runs on the alternative architecture. I initially ran at the minimum settings to test performance scaling with ZSS. After testing at 1080p, it seems like we actually run into a CPU bottleneck at a decent number of configurations, which I honestly wasn't expecting. After looking at the MSI Afterburner overlay, it does seem like only having 4 cores and 8 threads is holding the system back, and it makes me wonder how a 6-core part from the same line would perform in this situation. Either way, once ZSS is turned to balanced, you start to not gain additional performance and the image starts to look exponentially blurrier. Jumping up to 1440p, and the CPU bottleneck wasn't as pronounced, and performance improved as the internal resolution decreased. Here I don't think it's a CPU issue, and is instead the GPU taking the lead. The A770 is a strong card, but its design seems to limit what it's able to do on a lot of gaming titles. This seems to be one of them. And jumping up to 4K, the system once again showed performance scaling at all adjustments. Memory probably isn't an issue, considering the game only ever used 20GB of main memory, and the VRAM usage never went above 8GB. It seems like this system is capable of, at most, about 100 FPS on average due to the CPU. And whether you reach that, it seems to ultimately come down to the resolution of the image, as a lot of the settings like texture quality and filtering, the wave and water wetness settings, and raw mesh quality actually didn't seem to affect performance too much. But then there are some settings, like particle, lighting, and shadow quality, that can affect performance disproportionately. If you played Warzone in the past 3 or so years, the settings menu is going to look very similar, and although it did receive some interesting new animations over everything, the actual settings and what they do are relatively standard for a Call of Duty title. Moving on to the expensive build, and the minimum preset actually showed appropriate performance scaling at all resolutions, hinting that we aren't quite running into a CPU bottleneck yet. However, with DLSS, specifically the neural network option, showed a CPU bottleneck at both 1080 and 1440p. But when the transformer mode is active, suddenly the performance scaling returns. The transformer mode's 1% lows also looked more consistent between all the resolutions tested, which is where I think it's worth using over the CNN mode, at least on a 40 series card. Between all the upscaling methods, DLSS performs the best on this particular hardware combination, with the transformer mode pulling ahead by a few percent on average, and the 1% lows looking improved. FSR3 performed similarly to DLSS CNN mode at all resolutions, but looked blurry at 1080 and 1440p at least to me. ZSS looked similar to DLSS CNN in terms of the final image quality, and also had some smearing at the lower resolutions, but performance-wise it performed a little worse than either mode of DLSS. Without any upscaling at the minimum settings, the 4080 is able to push nearly 200 FPS on average at 1080p, with 1440p coming in at nearly 150 FPS. 4K remains completely playable, but the 1% lows look a little rough at the lowest resolution. The basic preset saw 1080p perform almost identically, but 1440p and 4K lost almost 10 FPS on average. Weirdly, the 1% low at 1080p also improved noticeably. And then jumping up to Ultra, and only 1080 and 1440p saw performance dips coming from Basic. And then because this is an uber expensive build, the Extreme preset saw every resolution lose another roughly 10 FPS on average, with the 1% lows falling substantially. I suspect this occurs when explosions fill up the screen, which happens quite a lot on this beta. Right off the bat, I think what caught my attention with the ARC system is the slightly tighter 1% lows at lower resolutions. I suspect this is primarily caused by a generally weaker GPU that bottlenecked the CPU less often. I know that's kind of wild to say, but the RTX 4080 is so powerful that we're CPU limited a surprising amount of the time. As a result, render times can be much more heavily affected whenever literally anything hits the CPU and causes an increase in latency. This is actually an incredibly common problem on cards like the 40 and 5090. But the fact that we're seeing it here makes sense because we've only got a 14700K. It's crazy that I even have to say that, but an X3D AM5 processor would provide additional performance, probably because it's faster and would also require DDR5. But even so, we're talking about over 200 FPS, which is a redonkulous amount of frames. If you're complaining we're hitting 210 FPS as opposed to 230, I kinda don't really know what to tell you. I think it's also worth mentioning outright that AMD GPUs perform better for the money in modern IW engine games, and they generally have more memory as well. Call of Duty uses VRAM as a texture cache, so increasing your memory footprint decreases the likelihood of you running into those weird low-resolution texture streaming issues that you'd see on 8GB cards. They'd still be able to run the game fine, but you might notice some low-resolution textures on smaller capacity cards. Thankfully, the engine architecture seems to favor raw performance and frame stability over high-resolution effects and textures, but when you've got the hardware to push it, things can look incredible.